Here are some of the items you'll need for the essential oils lab. First, you'll need a hot plate in order to heat some water. We'll use that later. We also need a heating mantle and a voltage supply for the heating mantle. We'll need a mortar and pestle for certain samples in order to grind them up. We'll also need a 3-necked round bottom flask, and that's going to sit in the heating mantle. But notice that there are 3 different openings to that round bottom flask. We'll also need some glassware for our simple distillation setup. So, sort of starting on the left here, we'll need some clamps to hold all the glassware together. We'll need a thermometer as well as a thermometer adapter. We also need a stopper, so that will close one of the holes in the round bottom flask. We'll also need a vacuum adapter, as well as a piece with a sidearm on it. We'll need a condenser. We'll also need some vacuum grease. And vacuum grease is what prevents glassware from sticking together if we build up a lot of pressure while heating. As you cool the glassware, a vacuum can form, and so the pieces can get stuck together. So we need some grease. We also need some receiving flasks. One flask will be for the first 10 milliliters of our essential oil, and the other flask will be for approximately 20 more milliliters of the essential oil. Then we also need a separatory funnel and some hoses, as well as potentially some platforms so we can increase or decrease the height of our receiving flask. In the first step of this lab, we're going to add our sample to the round bottom flask. I'm using ground cloves for this lab, but you can choose pretty much anything you want. Now, the cloves were previously ground. If they hadn't been, I would have used the mortar and pestle. So I'm going to add the cloves using a funnel. And I was struggling a little bit here with the weigh boat. Felt like it was going to pop out of my hands. Okay, so I've added the cloves, and then I'm just going to use a little bit of DI or deionized water to rinse the rest of the cloves into the round bottom flask. So we used about 5 grams of the ground cloves. It doesn't have to be exact, just as long as you have about 5 grams. So here I'm going to rinse the weigh boat just to make sure I get all of my sample into the round bottom flask. In the next step, I'm going to add enough water to fill the round bottom flask about halfway. So I'm just adding some DI water through a funnel. And again, you don't want to completely fill the round bottom flask. You really only want enough water to fill it just under halfway. And there we go. We've got our DI water mixed with the cloves. Next, I've set up the heating mantle. So the heating mantle is connected to the power supply, and then the power supply is connected to the outlet on the side of the fume hood. So now we can somewhat control the temperature of our solution. Now I'm going to set up the simple distillation apparatus. So the first thing I'm going to do is place the distillation adapter into the round bottom flask. But first, I'm going to apply some vacuum grease to the joint so that if we do form a vacuum, the glassware won't be stuck together. That can happen quite often. So I just placed a little bit of vacuum grease on the top of that joint, and I typically use a paper towel to wipe it around just so I don't get it on my gloves. And then I'm going to place this distillation adapter into the center opening of the round bottom flask. And then I twist the glassware to form a seal. So next, I'm going to block off the third opening of the round bottom flask with a stopper. However, I am going to grease this as well because this can likely get stuck if a vacuum does form. So again, I'm applying some vacuum grease. You really only need to apply it to the top part of the joint. You can wipe off the grease from the rest of the joint. And again, I'm just twisting it to form a seal. Now, the next piece I'm going to add on to this apparatus is a clamp. So the clamp will hold the distillation adapter to the round bottom flask, and the clamp has two parts. One part has a wider diameter, and the other part has a smaller diameter. So the smaller diameter will fit over the top of where the two pieces of glassware meet. The wider diameter will fit over the bottom. So you just snap it on and it will hold those two pieces together. Alright, so the next piece we're going to add on is the condenser. So the condenser is really interesting. It has two tubes, an outer tube and an inner tube. Now we're going to fit this onto the distillation adapter, again using some vacuum grease. And we will also need to use a clamp to hold the condenser because it's sort of suspended in midair. So the condenser has now been added using a clamp on a ring stand, and what I'm pointing to right now is an adjustable platform. I had to raise everything up because there are still some pieces that we're adding to the other end of the condenser, and they would have run into the countertop otherwise. Alright, so that's our vacuum adapter that we're going to add onto the end of the condenser. But of course, first we're going to add some vacuum grease to the joint to prevent the pieces from getting stuck together. Alright, so now we'll put the vacuum adapter on, and I'm going to twist it to form a seal, and then we're going to place a clamp around these two pieces so that they stay together. So I'm making sure everything is all nice and snug. And you don't have to use a clamp on every single piece. You'll notice I don't have a clamp on the front end of the condenser. That's okay. It should stay in place. So now we're going to add a thermometer adapter. So first I'm going to place my thermometer through this glass piece. And we're going to do this gently and slowly. And we want to make sure that the thermometer is sticking out quite a bit because the thermometer should actually sit below the side arm on our distillation adapter. So you'll see me demonstrating that there. Now again, we want to put some vacuum grease around that joint. And just be careful not to get it on the thermometer. And we'll just fit it into the distillation adapter. So again, notice that the thermometer bulb is below the side arm. That's important. You should also make sure you can easily see the temperature readings. So I've connected a couple of hoses to the condenser. So one hose, the yellow one, is connected to a DI water supply in the back of the hood. The other end of that hose is connected to the bottom of the condenser. So the idea here is that our sample is going to heat up and vaporize, and the vapor is going to travel down the condenser until it hits that cold water supply, and then it will condense at that point, and it will flow out of the vacuum adapter. Now the other hose, the orange one, that one is going to flow into a sink at the back of the hood. So water will travel up the condenser towards the round bottom flask and exit out of that hose. So the DI water supply is highlighted in green, so look for the green knob when you need to turn the water on. It's always a good idea to check that the hoses are set up correctly before you start your experiment. So I'm going to turn on the water supply, and you can see the water traveling up the condenser. Sometimes the hoses can pop off just due to the water pressure, so you always want to double check that everything is working correctly. Last but not least, we're going to add a separatory funnel to the last opening of the round bottom flask. A separatory funnel has a stopcock similar to a burette. When it's vertical, it's open and solution can flow through. When it's horizontal, it's closed and solution cannot flow through. So you always want to double check that before using the separatory funnel. Alright, so the reason we're using this separatory funnel is to add the hot water that we've been boiling. So as we run out of water in our round bottom flask, we can add more, but additionally this provides a source of steam. So I'm going to put some vacuum grease on the top of this joint before I add it to the round bottom flask. And then again, I'm going to twist it, make sure I have a seal, and I'm also keeping it closed for now. So I'll add the hot water to the separatory funnel, and then we can get started. So I've added the hot water to the separatory funnel, and I've also got my water running through the condenser. I have a receiving flask underneath the vacuum adapter. And now we can actually turn on our power supply and start heating the solution in the round bottom flask. So there's a few settings on here numbered 1 through 9. I'm going to start at about 4 and see if we get enough heat for our distillation. If not, I can always increase it until I see the temperature rising. One thing I wanted to point out about the condenser as we wait for this to heat up, the condenser actually has 2 tubes in it. There's an inner tube and then an outer tube, and the water is running through the outer tube. So the outer tube is completely separate, and again, that's where the water is flowing through. And then the inner tube is completely separate as well, and that's what our vapor is going to flow through. So it's kind of hard to see it in the video, but there are 2 different tubes in the condenser. Alright, so we can see that there's some vaporization occurring in our sample. It's also recondensing within the round bottom flask. Now I did have to adjust the setting on the voltage supply. I increased it to 8. So sometimes there's a bit of trial and error there. Alright, so this has been heating for a while and we're getting pretty close to the temperature we would expect for our essential oil. So you can see that the essential oil solution is boiling and there's condensation in the distillation adapter and the temperature has risen to about 80 degrees Celsius. So we're just waiting for that first drop, and it should come out of the vacuum adapter and into our receiving flask. And there it is. So we've got our first few droplets of essential oil. We're going to collect the first 10 milliliters separately, and then we'll collect the last 20 milliliters in a round bottom flask. So now we're going to collect the last 20 milliliters of sample in the round bottom flask, and then I'm going to turn off the heating mantle and let everything cool. We're also just going to let those last few droplets go through the condenser. Now we're going to use our separatory funnel in order to separate the essential oil from any water that may have mixed with the essential oil during distillation. So first we're going to add 1 gram of salt per 10 milliliters of our essential oil mixed with water. The salt will help to separate the essential oil from the water itself. Now you'll notice I placed some parafilm on top of my sample. That was to prevent it from evaporating. And then we're going to add about 5 milliliters of dichloromethane to the separatory funnel as well in order to help extract the essential oil. So here I've added 1 gram of salt to my first 10 milliliters of essential oil, and I'm just swirling in order to better dissolve it. Once I feel that it has fully dissolved, I'm going to add it into the separatory funnel. Alright, so just giving it a couple more shakes there. Now, of course, before you add any samples to the separatory funnel, make sure that the stopcock is closed or horizontal. So now I'm going to add about 5 milliliters of dichloromethane. As I add this, you'll notice 2 layers forming. So the next step is to mix those layers in order to get better extraction and separation. So I'm going to keep one finger on top of the stopper, and then I'm going to invert the separatory funnel a few times. But as I do this, pressure can build up inside of the separatory funnel. So in order to release that pressure, I'm going to open the stopcock valve, and you're going to hear a little hiss. And then I'll close it again and keep mixing. So when you're releasing the pressure using the stopcock valve, you always want to face the bottom away from you and towards the wall of the fume hood. Also face it away from others, because if enough pressure builds up, we don't want that to spray into somebody's face, for instance. Alright, so once I'm done mixing, I'm going to let those layers settle and separate. Now once they've settled and separated, we have to think about a few things here. So we know we have an aqueous layer and a dichloromethane layer. But which one is which? Which one is on top? Also, which layer is our essential oil dissolved in? Will our essential oil dissolve in the water or in the dichloromethane? One way you can figure out which layer is which is to look up the densities of water and of dichloromethane. Whichever one is more dense will sink to the bottom. Also, think about solubility. Like dissolves like. So would the essential oil dissolve in the dichloromethane or the water? Just some things to think about. So in the next step, I'm going to collect the essential oil layer and set it aside. So after I collected the first set of essential oil, I added another 5 milliliters of dichloromethane for extraction. And here I'm just mixing again and releasing the pressure. And then we're going to let the layers settle again, and then we'll collect the essential oil again. Alright, so once I'm done collecting the essential oil from the first 10 milliliters of sample, I'm then going to extract the essential oils from the round bottom flask or the last 20 milliliters of sample that I collected. So we'll do this all again. Okay, so I've collected all of my essential oil. I might need to evaporate off any solvent that's mixed in with it. But I'm going to weigh the final amount of essential oil in this flask here. So a good idea is to weigh this flask first and then place your essential oil in it to get an accurate weight. And you can find the mass of our essential oil in your lab procedure if you're doing this lab online.